It's January 20th, 2025. Having narrowly won the 2024 United States presidential election, Donald Trump is sworn in as president. For the first time in history, a convicted criminal awaiting sentencing is elected as leader of a major Western democracy, something that was inconceivable until recently. For the first time in history, someone still facing dozens of serious criminal charges, including for election subversion and endangering national security, is elected as leader of a major democracy, something that was inconceivable until recently. For the first time in history, someone who tried to overthrow a valid presidential election is elected leader of that very same nation, something inconceivable until recently. For the first time in history, someone who provoked a violent insurrection against his nation's government and tried to illegally retain power is elected leader of that very same nation, something previously inconceivable. For the first time in history, someone seeking office to avoid jail time for some of the most serious crimes in political history is elected leader of that very same nation, something previously inconceivable. For the first time in history, someone who'll clearly do anything to hold power for life is somehow elected leader of that very nation, previously inconceivable. For only the second time in history, someone with a clear, obvious, and dangerous psychiatric illness, malignant narcissism, is elected as leader of a major Western democracy, something inconceivable until it first happened in 2016. For only the second time in history, someone who's obviously psychiatrically insane, an obvious psychopath, an obvious sociopath, and an obviously self-obsessed egomaniac is elected as leader of a major Western democracy, something inconceivable until it first happened in 2016. For only the second time in history, someone who's the very embodiment of an obnoxious thug and bully with a vocabulary and speech patterns rated at 4th grade level is elected leader of a major Western democracy, something inconceivable until 2016. Despite being rightly disliked and distrusted by a clear majority of Americans, despite having a permanent disapproval rating of well above 50%, despite being a known criminal and insurrectionist with contempt for democracy and the rule of law, Trump, shockingly, inconceivably, catastrophically, is back. Millions of jubilant, fanatical MAGA cult members are transported to Washington to flood Trump's second inauguration and prove the leader's unique love and popularity among true Americans. In the service of Trump's voracious, deluded ego, it's hailed by Fox News and his other cult propagandists as the greatest show of love and admiration in American history. Upon inauguration, and unusually true to his word, Trump uses emergency powers to order federal troops to suppress any protest and dissent. In the ultimate irony, many protesters are arrested as treasonous insurrectionists and jailed under emergency presidential powers. It's enough to ensure that horrified, patriotic Americans who have families to support and protect will think twice about openly resisting hereafter. Any US military or federal law enforcement leaders who refuse to apply Trump's orders are quickly dismissed. Some are arrested to face court-martial for insubordination. They're accused of treason and replaced in the military and law enforcement with MAGA loyalists who will blindly apply Trump's orders. The most powerful military in the world effectively becomes a MAGA cult militia under Trump's total command. Within days or weeks of inauguration, Trump fires the FBI director and CIA director and replaces them with fanatical MAGA loyalists. As a conventional military leader who remains loyal to the Constitution over the President, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is also fired and replaced with a MAGA loyalist who'll do and order whatever Trump wants. When Senate Democrats seek to deny confirmation, citing the new appointments as obviously unqualified and dangerous, Trump ignores them and keeps his appointments in place. When Democrats refer constitutional breaches to the Supreme Court, Trump's 6 partisan judges again find another corrupt and lawless way to rule in his favour. When Trump ultimately breaches constitutional boundaries in ways that are undeniable and incontestable, and his partisan Supreme Court finally moves to check his ultimate power, Trump ignores them. With full command of a US military now led by MAGA loyalists, Trump taunts the court to somehow enforce its rulings against him and commands his cult members to intimidate the justices. The court, except as a rubber stamp and fake validator of Trump's dictatorship, is rendered powerless and meaningless. Trump can and will lawlessly do as he pleases. The deranged dictator soon has all 4 elements he needs for absolute power and protection. 1, a stacked and compliant military led by his own MAGA cult members. 2, a stacked and compliant law enforcement led by his own MAGA cult members willing to do his bidding and persecute opposition. 3, a judiciary that's either loyal and compliant or else lives in fear of retribution. Either way, that judiciary has no military power and command of its own to defy or remove the president. And 4, the ability to ignore constitutional norms, because no government institution has the military power to enforce them upon him. All lessons from the failed MAGA insurrection of 2020 are now learned. All institutional checks and balances that many American swing voters naively, complacently believed would protect them from a madman dictatorship are rendered impotent. All power over federal intelligence, investigation and enforcement is quickly brought under the control of people blindly loyal and devoted to Trump, and who are protected by his increasingly absolute power. All checks and balances are effectively gone. The rule of law is effectively gone. Through his loyalist Attorney General, Trump orders the Justice Department to drop all remaining criminal charges against him and to publicly decry them as hoaxes. He orders that all the overwhelming evidence compiled by prosecutors be hastily destroyed in case Trump should ever lose power and those prosecutions be restarted. He orders that his 34 unanimous jury convictions in New York be overturned and decried as hoaxes. Instead, the prosecutors and judges who legitimately tried to hold Trump criminally accountable are now arrested and prosecuted by Trump's purged Department of Justice under completely fraudulent charges. They include Jack Smith, Judge Tanya Chutkan, and Judge Juan Merchan, among others. Trump pardons all January 6 rioters and insurrectionists, releasing them from jail. Every violent, brainwashed thug who commits violence and crime in the service of Trump and MAGA now does so with the knowledge that they're protected by both his corrupted justice system and his presidential pardon power. No American is now safe from the hatred and violence of Trump's messianic cult. He also pardons all co-conspirators who helped him try to steal the 2020 election and prepares to pardon anyone who helped him lay the groundwork to steal the 2024 election had it been necessary. In any case, Trump's new Justice Department will avoid charging any of those people. Trump also pardons anyone charged under federal law for trying to buy him swing state votes through illegal lotteries and payouts. All administrative power over federal judge and jury selection is taken over by Trump's MAGA loyalists. It's a classic fascist authoritarian takeover. The new nature of America's justice system becomes clear. If you loyally worship Trump, you're safe, protected, and above the law. If you rightly oppose and defy Trump, the law is coming for you. Trump decrees that all federal employees must regard the 2020 presidential election as having been fraudulently stolen from him and must never speak to the contrary. Anyone resisting that narrative is fired and persecuted. All public officials who'd helped protect the valid 2020 outcome are decried as treasonous. They're also prosecuted and persecuted. For the sake of Trump's childlike lunatic ego, President Biden and Vice President Harris are themselves decried as having never been legitimately elected. They're decried as 2020 election deniers and guilty of treason. As eloquent as ever, Trump decries them as really bad, horrible people, really, really bad people. They destroyed our nation, you know. Terrible people. Nothing that officially records Trump as ever having lost an election is allowed to stand. In the service of the insane autocrat, everything true becomes officially false. Everything false becomes officially true. With his all-consuming narcissism and egomania reaching new extremes, Trump orders a new national day of celebration in his honour. It involves a military parade, huge images of his likeness, and a national broadcast of Trump's cronies and selected MAGA celebrities, praising his unique greatness, genius and sacredness to American life. Trump orders a monument in his honour to rival the Lincoln Memorial. New warships, bridges and buildings are named in his honour, with the occasional minor naming used to reward a loyal crony. All pictures of recent former presidents are removed from the White House and other federal buildings. The entire US executive government becomes a shrine to the glory, validation and adulation of one deranged egomaniac. A new line of glorious Trump memorabilia is launched to the cult. Figurines, mini statues, exultant images, limited edition drinks coasters. Like everything Trump, it's tacky, shallow, grandiose, soulless, self-obsessed, shameless, anti-intelligent, thuggish, obnoxious, nakedly venal and cynical, nakedly dishonest and manipulative, almost joyously dark, depraved, and dishonourable. It's everything human leadership and inspiration is supposed not to be. Some MAGA Republicans go above and beyond in their now criminal fawning and devotion to Trump, in the secret hope that he'll anoint them as his MAGA dictatorship successor for when the time comes. Trump, believing in nothing and caring only about himself, gives no thought or care to succession. He simply uses, abuses and discards his disciples, as he always has, to his own self-obsessed ends. All elected Democrats and remorseful moderate Republicans who stand up to Trump and who seek to impeach and remove him for new constitutional illegality are decried as election deniers, insurrectionists and traitors. They're accused of being the enemy within, of trying to overturn the divine will of the people and rob the people of their sacred, beloved genius leader. MAGA goon squads are given those Democrats' addresses. Their families are harassed and threatened, with the FBI and other federal law enforcement privately forbidden to intervene. Where possible, Trump seeks to have the Justice Department and MAGA-led FBI arrest any Democrats or remorseful Republican defectors who move against him. They're corruptly pursued by Trump-appointed prosecutors under the Insurrection Act and Trump's self-declared emergency powers. The only small protection for Trump's critics and opponents is Democratic state governors who order their state police and small militaries to protect MAGA-harassed citizens and uphold constitutional rights and protections. Trump's federal authorities cite those governors as supporting and giving comfort to insurrection and efforts to overthrow the great, rightful and beloved leader. Federal law enforcement's ordered to arrest those governors as coup-supporting insurrectionists, sparking tense state border standoffs between federal and state forces. With the protection of state forces, those democratic governors managed to stay free and protected within their own state borders, but are rendered powerless to overthrow the lunatic dictator. As the United States plunges into a tyrannical hell and its deepest ever crisis, the simmering menace and violence becomes too obvious for even disengaged Americans to ignore. Using his presidential platform, Trump broadcasts an Oval Office address claiming the tension and violence is the responsibility of radical left lunatics who refuse to accept the outcome of the 2024 election. As usual, he lies and gaslights endlessly. When Democrats counter and explain that Trump is breaking fresh constitutional boundaries and must now be removed at virtually any cost for the protection of both democracy and freedom, their truthful message is violently suppressed. Trump orders the Federal Communications Commission to suspend the broadcast licences of media that are truthful and critical about him and cover his increasingly autocratic behaviour. When the Commission pushes back, Trump fires its board and executives and installs MAGA loyalists who'll do his bidding. The newly installed Commission sets about bullying, threatening and intimidating any and all media outlets to the impartial side of Fox News. In the name of basic survival, many outlets soften their approach, suppressing the full horrifying truth of what's happening and further allowing the insane dictator to remain normalised and legitimised with disengaged swing voters. Many swing voters and moderate Republicans do suddenly realise their terrible mistake, but it's too late. Many are deeply confused and angry about why media and internet news sources didn't remind them, day in, day out for 4 years, that Trump's an insurrectionist who tried to overthrow a valid election. Many are deeply confused and angry about why media and internet news sources didn't remind them, day in, day out through 2024, that Trump's a convicted criminal awaiting sentencing and facing dozens more serious charges. Many are deeply confused and angry about why media and internet news sources didn't remind them, day in, day out, for 4 years, that Trump's clearly insane, incoherent, sociopathic, and psychiatrically incapable of caring about anyone or anything but himself. While those people's disastrous vote is ultimately their responsibility, those are also valid confusions to have. Among those who realise and regret their terrible mistake are swing voters who'd only backed Trump in 2024 because they wrongly blamed Biden and Harris for post-COVID inflation and squeezed living standards. Ironically, Trump's massive tariffs re-spike inflation and costs ordinary Americans thousands more dollars a year, compared to the middle-class tax cut and tough action against price gouging that Kamala Harris was promising. Living standards plummet further, with no wealth redistribution of any kind. Trump again gives massive tax cuts to billionaire oligarchs who support him, paid for by the tariffs costing ordinary Americans. Despite Trump's inflationary tariffs and tax cuts for the rich being clear and obvious before the election, the tacky, thuggish, lying con man has somehow prevailed again. In one terrible, complacent mistake, American swing voters have lost their democracy, their constitution, their normality of life, many of their freedoms, and ironically, even more of their living standards. Swing voters who somehow thought they could just focus on Trump's dishonest policies, who thought they could somehow treat him as normal and legitimate as a candidate, who thought they could somehow just ignore his clear insanity, his awful character, his proven criminality, his January 6th insurrection, his blatant psychiatric illness, are all now hostages to the same dystopian nightmare as every other non-cult member. To repay Vladimir Putin for years of background support and propaganda, and because he's forever ensnared by Putin's private blackmail, and having made a shallow populist pledge not to spend US money supporting allies at war, Trump immediately pulls out of NATO and ends US support for Ukraine. Ukraine is crushed and fully annexed by Russia in a few weeks. Ukrainian President Zelensky manages to flee to Western Europe. Putin now eyes other Eastern European nations that are suddenly left without hope of US military support or protection. Europe, alone and menaced by Putin, is plunged even further into crisis. Asian and Pacific democracies are now at the mercy of China, knowing that any morally based US military alliances are now worthless. A new dark age of fear, menace, and hardship grips the Western world. American foreign policy becomes a purely transactional and amoral game designed purely for Trump's personal glory and protection. Any nations that praise and flatter the dictator are given qualified support and protection. Any nations that stand up to him and stand up for American democracy and decency are brutally punished and left exposed. Trump even threatens to invade some of them out of his usual ego-mad spite and rage. With the world's most powerful economy and most powerful military now a strategic plaything of a self-obsessed sociopathic lunatic, the whole Western world and economy is brought to its knees. While all of this transpires into 2025 and beyond, the NFL, NBL and MLB seasons proceed as normal. Hollywood keeps rolling out films, although they're now subject to heavy regime censorship, with anything critical of Trump or portraying America's new dystopian reality being penalised out of existence. Christmas and Thanksgiving roll by each year, along with 2 new national holidays in honour of Trump and MAGA. While they're shocked at what they're hearing in some news circles, many Americans simply shrug and go about their normal lives, just as Russians do under Putin. Many swing voters obviously regret their vote, but they're now powerless to do anything about the slide into an insane and repressive totalitarian dictatorship. Most just find it easier to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. As long as everyday life carries on, with jobs and schools and bars and diners to go to as usual, it's simply not worth risking their lives and livelihoods in a fight to protect and restore American democracy. Beneath the fake normality, though, America descends into an inconceivably dark, dystopian dictatorship of hell, taking the Western world down with it. But there's even worse to come. Just as he did in 2024, Trump knows he must either rule America for life or face numerous criminal convictions and the likelihood of dying in prison. Just as he did in 2024, Trump knows that any significant portion of his life not spent in the protection of the presidency is likely to be spent in prison, which he'll never accept. And just like before, Trump's deranged ego can't abide any concept of public defeat or surrender. Everything he gains, including power and status, must forever be retained. As a malignant narcissist and psychopath, Trump's far too addicted to the power, status, and prestige of the presidency to ever willingly relinquish it. Trump has everything to lose, including his physical freedom. He's more psychiatrically ill and insane than ever. He's still traumatised by the self-inflicted legal ordeals of 2020 to 24. He's desperate to stay forever safe from prosecution, accountability, and humiliation. And he has that fragile, childlike ego that can't accept any concept of defeat or retreat. He's 100% all in. As 2028 draws nearer, it soon becomes apparent that Trump has no intention of surrendering power. Like Putin in Russia or Xi in China, he's determined to ignore and overturn term limits. Whatever it takes, Trump intends to rule America for life. Deep down, ever since first tasting political power and glory in 2016, he always has. Claiming he was fraudulently denied Joe Biden's presidential term between 2020 and 24, and under the pretext of likely similar election fraud in the future, Trump orders a hand-picked panel of loyalists to officially investigate election integrity. They conveniently conclude that Trump actually won the 2020 election and was denied by massive fraud, supposedly led by Democrats, declaring that it'll take lots of time and arrests to make our elections legitimate again, and claiming that admiring American voters have now elected him 3 times in a row anyway. Trump moves to either suspend elections or moves to Putinize them, so only he can realistically win. When the Federal Election Commission defies Trump, seeks to enforce the presidential 2-term limit in the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution, and says it will conduct a free and fair 2028 presidential election as normal without him, Trump fires the commissioners and appoints MAGA loyalists in their place. When Democrats and pro-democracy lawyers take the issue of term limits to the Supreme Court, which now includes a certain Judge Eileen Mercedes Cannon, Trump's majority of partisan judges find a bizarre and lawless way to back him. Even if the court sees no option but to rule against him, Trump, again, simply ignores them. He has the full command of a US military now led by MAGA loyalists. The Supreme Court commands nothing of the like to impose its rulings and impose the Constitution. After more than 2 centuries of 4 yearly presidential elections and many decades of the 2-term limit, Trump has finally defeated and destroyed American democracy for his own ego and protection. With Trump's fascist dictatorship now undoubtable and undeniable, congressional Democrats again move to impeach and remove him for constitutional crimes. They seek the reluctant support of moderate Republican lawmakers. While those Republicans know they're now entering dangerous, complicit criminality themselves, they also know they'll be swept away politically and rendered powerless if Trump declares them enemies and sets his MAGA Republican cult upon them. With US democracy itself on the brink of destruction, some moderates finally find the courage to defy Trump and do the right thing. Many still do not. Even if Congress finds the numbers to impeach and convict Trump, he ignores them and still refuses to cede power. The Supreme Court commands no military to enforce the Constitution. Congress controls no military to enforce Trump's impeachment and removal. Legality no longer matters or applies. Illegality no longer matters or applies. Only Trump's absolute power, held through military command and control, actually matters. Now realising the full extent of Trump's tyranny, many US servicemen and women in the Army, Navy and Air Force now look to desert and defect to the growing pro-democracy resistance forces slowly marshalling in private. But most, unfortunately, stay put. Some because they're genuine MAGA loyalists, others knowing that if they defy their all-powerful Commander-in-Chief and MAGA generals and defect from the official US military, they risk court-martial with all its terrible consequences. While some put country and patriotism ahead of their own safety by defecting, a clear majority of US military forces remain under the command and control of Trump's military dictatorship. All the anti-Trump forces can do at the beginning is survive and organise. A largely quiet and underground movement of political, military, legal and grassroots forces lays low, gathers strength and waits, building slowly towards the inevitable righteous counter-coup and potential civil war needed to finally oust Trump, jail him and restore American democracy. Pro-democracy leaders, including several leading Democrat politicians, now face an awful dilemma. Staying in the US to lead the resistance and fight for Trump's removal risks their own life and freedom. But fleeing to the protection of other Western nations risks leaving pro-democracy Americans alone and voiceless against the tyrant's brutality and lawlessness. It risks a huge disconnect with resistance forces, and it risks a big propaganda weapon for the dictatorship. Ultimately, recognising that they can't lead the uprising if they're dead or imprisoned, resistance leaders soon flee to the relative sanctuary of NATO Europe. In London, resistance leaders like Barack Obama, Liz Cheney, Kamala Harris and Adam Kinzinger gather to plot Operation Liberty. It's a mission to launch a US insurgency supported by underground resistance forces, to oust and jail Trump and his loyalists, and to restore American democracy. They're joined by several US generals and admirals, some out of retirement, who are committed to the Constitution and resistance cause. In preparation for forcing Trump from power, plans are made to install an interim US executive government, with Harris as temporary president and Cheney as vice president. They pledge to hold a free and fair popular vote election within 6 months of toppling Trump, an election which, for obvious reason, a pro-democracy resistance Democrat will overwhelmingly win. While Obama, as the most experienced American leader in the resistance, leads much of the rebel planning and communication, he pledges not to serve as interim president or stand for election out of respect for constitutional term limits. Harris, who will serve as interim president while democracy is restored, also pledges not to stand at the subsequent election out of respect for having been democratically defeated in 2024. Each side's advantages in the looming conflict are evenly split. Both in London and laying low in the US, the resistance has the best and sanest military leaders and tacticians, all loyal to democracy and the Constitution. That's compared to many of Trump's unqualified and extremist MAGA goons and wackos now serving as US military leaders. The resistance also has passionate majority support, both in America and across the Western world. But Trump's military dictatorship holds the continental United States itself, holds all of its military strength and assets, holds its entire nuclear arsenal, and is led by an insane lunatic psychopath with no morality or care for anyone or anything but himself. If finally cornered and in danger, Trump will literally stop at nothing to protect himself and his grip on power. Apart from a few countries led by far-right governments, Western nations and the remaining NATO members overwhelmingly support the rebel resistance and condemn Trump's dictatorship and corruption. While menaced by an emboldened Putin on their eastern flank, European powers can spare just enough military counterbalance to give sanctuary to resistance leaders. Trump demands that Britain expedite resistance leaders and generals back to America or face military consequences. The British government stands firm to its democratic principles and bravely protects the resistance amid Trump's military intimidation. Combined Western nations like Britain, France, Germany, Canada, Australia and Japan provide the weaponry and military resources the resistance forces need to attempt the necessary counter-coup. But those nations aren't willing to participate in a direct invasion of Trump's United States, however morally justified. In the final battle to destroy Trump and restore American democracy, it will purely and tragically be a case of Americans fighting and killing other Americans on home soil. After months of recruitment and planning, the resistance is ready. Operation Liberty is ready. The Western democratic world holds its breath for the biggest day in military history since D-Day. The remaining free world awaits the ultimate battle for America. And that's where our crystal ball story of the future ends. The rest, sadly, is unknown. The success or failure of Operation Liberty is unknown. Whether brave resistance patriots can free America from fascist dictatorship in Trump's lifetime or beyond it is unknown. The ultimate price in pain, suffering and lives of restoring freedom, liberty and democracy to the world's most powerful nation is unknown. There are some people who'll dismiss the terrifying scenario I've just laid out. They'll dismiss it as impossible and inconceivable. They'll say it's impossible and inconceivable that an established democracy, the world's most powerful democracy, could end up as a lunatic military dictatorship without free and fair elections. even at the hands of a monster as insane, self-obsessed, criminal and dangerous as Trump. And sure, like any story of the future, the story I've just told is speculative. Should Trump win in 2024 or successfully overturn a loss against Harris, some of it may come true, some of it may not. But everything I've said is fully based on what we already know Trump is, immorally and psychiatrically. What we know Trump wants, and what Trump's already done before. To the people who insist that it's inconceivable, I encourage you to return to the start of this video. Think about the things that were also inconceivable in American life until now. That a convicted criminal could be an electable candidate for president. That someone who provoked a violent insurrection to try and steal a valid election could ever again be an electable candidate for president. That the legal and judicial institutions of the United States, almost 4 years after January 6th, would have still not managed to hold that person legally accountable and to make his new grab for self-serving and self-protecting presidential power unviable. And that partisan Supreme Court judges would ignore and step outside rational law to protect a lunatic criminal candidate for president. To the people who say it's inconceivable, I'd ask you to think about the things that were also inconceivable in American political life until 2016, including that any electorate of voters would ever be self-endangering enough to elect someone with a clear and dangerous psychiatric illness in the first place. Think of all the supposed inconceivables Trump and his MAGA cult have crashed through and demolished in the past 9 years. If Trump's elected in 2024, do you seriously think the inconceivables are going to stop collapsing? Do you seriously think that terrifying trajectory's going to change, going to reverse? On the contrary, everything I've crystal balled is surely obvious. If you elect someone who already tried to provoke a violent insurrection and tried to retain power illegally, surely it's obvious that he'll do it again. That should be obvious to every swing voter who's not being treasonously lied to and deluded. If you elect a criminal who's shown total contempt for democracy, the law and elections, surely it's obvious that he's going to seek to rule for life. If you elect someone with a serious narcissistic personality disorder who can't accept any criticism or defeat or surrender, surely it's obvious that he'll end up being a lunatic military dictator. If you elect an insane lunatic who faces dying in prison if he can't live forever in the presidency, surely it's just obvious that he'll do anything to stay president for life. All these things should be obvious to every sane person who's not a cult member. How can they not be? To the conceivability skeptics, please ask and test yourself with these few simple questions and answer them as any sane, rational, factual person would answer. Will Trump, if elected, hold ultimate commander-in-chief command and obedience of the world's most powerful military? Yes, he will. Will Trump have the ultimate power to appoint the leaders of that military and ensure they're his fanatical loyalists? Yes, he will. Will the institutions that Americans would rely on to enforce democracy, enforce the Constitution, and enforce elections, like Congress and the courts, hold any military power and command to rival Trump? No, they won't. Is a clearly insane and narcissistic person who faces prison and destruction if he ever leaves power, likely to do anything it takes to stay in power for life? Yes, obviously, he is. Is a known criminal given immunity for official acts going to rule as a cruel and criminal tyrant? Yes, he is. Surely it's all so painfully obvious. It's important to state at this point that I sincerely hope I'm wrong. Not wrong about the life-ruining horror and consequences of Trump being president for any length of time, because that's beyond certain, beyond any doubt. But if Trump does win in November 2024, I sincerely hope that he will somehow be enforcibly impeached and removed for fresh crimes before 2028, despite him commanding and controlling the US military to his own protection. Or if Trump does happen to serve a full, disastrous, chaotic, dystopian, cataclysmic 4 years, I sincerely hope that he'll leave willingly at the end of it, therefore accepting prison and disgrace, therefore accepting that he'll be freshly prosecuted and likely jailed for life. I have trouble seeing that as a likely outcome, though, because, again, I can't see how such an insane, narcissistic psychopath would ever willingly submit himself to that fate, however deserved and necessary. But who knows? And believe it or not, a Trump victory in 2024, despite all the horror and suffering and dystopia, does actually have some long-term advantages. America descending into fascist tyranny at Trump's hands will finally break the spell. It will ultimately destroy Trump with virtually everyone but his cult, in a way that actually defeating and jailing him in 2024 probably won't achieve. In the end, the extreme dystopian consequences of Trump prevailing in 2024 will finally damn him and condemn him with swing voters as the insane and dangerous pariah of history that he should have been known as all along. And to be brutally honest, maybe that's what it'll take to finally break the spell. Maybe that horror and those awful consequences and suffering are the only way that some swing voters will wake up and realise the stakes. That's a hell of a price for every innocent person to pay for finally curing that dangerous apathy, dangerous complacency, dangerous delusion. It's an unthinkable price for every child who should have grown up in freedom instead of dystopia. It's a terrible and unprecedented price that will linger for generations. But tragically, maybe that's what it'll finally take, because nothing else has destroyed Trump yet, when in a sane and properly informed world, any number of things should have completely destroyed and invalidated him already. What must never happen, and what must never be allowed to happen at virtually any cost, is some kind of weak, pragmatic deal that allows Trump to escape accountability, to escape prosecution, to escape jail, to escape total reputational destruction in the eyes of history, even in return for willingly leaving power and retreating to the shadows. If Trump gets to 2028 and somehow decides it's too personally risky for him to defy term limits, to defy the Constitution and just stay, and if he reaches out to Democrats and any remaining non-MAGA authorities for some kind of immunity from prosecution, some way to escape justice and prison in return for going quietly, that must never, ever happen. That perversion of history must never, ever be agreed to at any cost, under any circumstances. However this nightmare ends, Trump must finish up disgraced and destroyed in history, not legitimised. He must end up fallen and reviled in history, not normalised or minimised or just some matter of opinion. That's crucially important, not just because it's Trump who deserves and necessitates that downfall and destruction for what he is and what he's done, but it's also as an example, a deterrent to other would-be Trumps, whether insane like him or just evil and ambitious, that you cannot endanger and destroy democracy and get away with it, that you cannot be a dangerous, criminally insane autocrat and somehow get away with it. Ultimately, whatever happens on November 5th, 2024, This terrifying situation is not sustainable. It's simply not sustainable for roughly half the voters in the Western world's most powerful nation, including millions of swing voters, to vote to end democracy and elevate insanity, while the other half desperately tries to hold out. It's just not sustainable for roughly half the voters in the Western world's most powerful nation, including millions of swing voters, to somehow not even realise the unthinkable peril they're voting to inflict on themselves, other Americans, and humanity. It's not sustainable for roughly half the voters in the Western world's most powerful nation, including millions of swing voters, to stew in such a dangerous media and propaganda ecosystem that it leaves them this dangerously and complacently detached from reality. Free speech, a free media, including online wackos, and the right to be wrong, the right to be deluded, are key principles of freedom and democracy. So, I don't know what the ultimate solution is on these fronts. I just know that it's not safe and sustainable for America and for humanity more broadly to go on living and surviving under this dark, deluded, dystopian cloud of constant peril, constant oblivion. The people who invented American democracy and the Constitution must have done so on the assumption that no electorate of voters would ever be so desperate, so deluded and self-endangering as to elect a truly insane and dangerous demagogue. They assumed that voters would elect left-wing leaders, right-wing leaders, some good leaders, some poor leaders, some people of varying intelligence and personality, under which normal life would always go on. But they appear to have done so on the understandable assumption that no electorate of American voters would ever be so desperate, so deluded and so self-endangering as to elect a truly insane, fascistic and dangerous demagogue. In 2016, after more than 2 centuries, they were finally proven wrong. 2024, just by the closeness of this election, let alone the catastrophic possible outcome, proves just how wrong they really were. There's a few people and institutions that need to share some responsibility for this once inconceivable mess. The modern political left, while still abundantly good, has done nowhere near enough to share and redirect wealth directly from the extremely rich to the struggling middle and working class, as should always be its main purpose and reason for existing. Instead, parts of the modern left have often paid far too much focus to ridiculous, irrational, sometimes puritanical identity politics that goes way beyond the right and crucial battle against prejudice and discrimination, and that alienates struggling working class voters who want their own struggle put first and want circumstance prioritised over identity. Overall, the modern left's been largely complacent about falling living standards and rising costs from pandemic inflation. Although I accept it's very hard to achieve serious legislated wealth sharing when a political right that's fiercely opposed to it stands fully in the way. But without substantial poverty, inequality and economic suffering, Trump's devastating fake working class populism would not have been possible. His absurd, exploitative con job would not have been possible. His very rise would not have been possible. Our modern media undoubtedly bears some responsibility for Trump. Whatever its intentions, and despite there being many good, intelligent and well-intentioned journalists involved, the overall media has ultimately managed to normalise and sanewash the most abnormal and insane political figure imaginable, the most dangerous political lunatic of our lifetimes. Unable to cope with the sheer level of bad faith, dishonesty and delusion that Trump and MAGA Republicans have flooded into the scene, it has treated the sacred principle of fairness and impartiality as somewhere halfway between sanity and insanity, somewhere halfway between obvious truth and blatant lies. somewhere halfway between decency and derangement, somewhere halfway between a sane and normal presidential candidate, just like the 100 or so major party candidates before her, and the first and only candidate for President of the United States to be clearly psychiatrically unfit and illegitimate. It's mostly covered this completely abnormal and existentially crucial election as the same old normal horse race that comes around every 4 years, with the same old appetite for controversy over wisdom, inflaming over informing, and ratings over rationality. While Republicans devoted to Trump flood the internet and social media feeds with unmediated lies and propaganda dressed as infotainment, the only sane and safe side of the battle still relies largely on a mainstream media devoted to he said, she said, and we're just in the middle. Somehow, that over-reliance has to change. And finally, there's responsibility for the judiciary and legal system that should have long since convicted and jailed Trump for his numerous crimes, putting the presidency safely beyond his reach. Instead, that paralysed justice system has allowed Trump's lawyers to delay and obfuscate the legal process at every turn, month after month, with frivolous bad faith arguments and appeals. It's allowed one of the most dangerous criminals in US history to waltz up to election day without open and shut convictions and upcoming jail sentences to his name. It's allowed him to commit contempt of court almost a dozen times with small fines and without spending any time in a jail cell. It's treated him with deference and indulgence that no other criminal defendant would ever receive, making a mockery of all Americans being equal before the law. It's allowed a clearly corrupt Trump-appointed judge in Florida to unlawfully throw out Trump's open and shut classified documents case on false grounds in a lawless decision that'll be overturned post-election. And even when Trump was finally convicted on 34 criminal charges in May 2024, the judge, wary and intimidated by the moment, postponed his sentencing until after the election. I defy you to find a situation anywhere in the democratic world where such a serious criminal, facing guaranteed years in jail, was allowed to cheat, manipulate and defy justice so brazenly, so sickeningly for so long, with such unbearably tragic and dangerous consequences. Even Mitch McConnell could have buried Trump in history by allowing the Senate to convict his second impeachment after January 6th, therefore disqualifying Trump from future office. Instead, full of cowardice and expedience towards the MAGA Republican cult, McConnell ducked Senate conviction and insisted the courts and legal system should and would take care of Trump instead, only to watch those courts spend 4 years largely failing to do so. To be clear, and with McConnell aside, none of these parties, the modern left, the mainstream media, the judiciary and legal system, really deserve too much of our blame and scorn. I'm not going to dwell on their shortcomings. There's enough anger, blame, frustration, division, recrimination already wrapped up in this mess. Whatever the share of responsibility for the inconceivable becoming perilously real, the real culprits are fairly obvious. The real adversary is too existentially dangerous for us to turn on each other now, lost in blame and despair. We're all victims of Trump, albeit that we must stay strong and brave and never let ourselves helplessly play the victim. Perhaps, here and now, potentially on the brink of the terrifying unknown, we all bear some responsibility for the evils that threaten us, and we can all do better at seeking out the solutions. But importantly, I actually want to finish this video with a message of hope and optimism amid all the terrifying peril and darkness. And that message is that however long it takes, And however much it ultimately costs Americans and humanity, it remains almost certain that Trump will be destroyed and jailed in his lifetime. Ideally and hopefully, that happens as soon as 2025, because Trump loses the election, he's sentenced to incarceration for his 34 New York convictions, and by the end of 2025 he's convicted and jailed long term for his numerous other crimes. But even if the worst happens on and after November 5th, 2024, the odds are still overwhelming that Trump will ultimately fall, ultimately be destroyed, and ultimately die in jail as an horrific and reviled figure of human history. That ending may take several horrible, dark and traumatic years, some of the darkest humanity has ever known. It may not happen until the years after 2028, once Trump has defiled the most sacred principles of democracy. And it may need bringing about at an unprecedented and unthinkable cost. But unless he dies in power, it will almost certainly happen in Trump's lifetime. And that highlights one of the purposes of this video. When that reckoning eventually comes for Trump, the cowardly cronies who loyally enabled him will appear before the Nuremberg trials of the day, probably crying, probably pleading for their freedom, and say they never imagined Trump could be such an autocrat. They'll finally decry Trump and say they never could have imagined he'd seek to cancel elections and rule America for life. They'll say they thought he'd ultimately respect American democracy and the Constitution, despite his obvious narcissistic insanity. They'll say they never knew he could end up being so deranged and dangerous. It's all more bullshit. They did know. They all knew. They knew all along. They knew every day for years. They all knew they were surrendering their integrity and condemning their nation, their own families, their own children, and Americans in general to a psychiatrically ill, lunatic autocracy. They did it because all they cared about was their own ambition. They did it because all they cared about was staying welcome and staying elected in Trump's Republican Party cult. When the time finally comes, those cowards and enablers, just like Trump, must be held accountable. I know that hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people in America and around the world, yearn deeply for that day. Yearn deeply for the day this insane, deranged and evil monster can't hurt and endanger Americans and humanity anymore. Yearn deeply for the day and beyond that Trump is finally gone from our lives, finally accountable and imprisoned, and finally destroyed in the eyes of all but his most brainwashed millions of cult members who'll likely worship him fervently until the day they die. Please know that hundreds and thousands of good, smart, courageous people will go on devoting their lives and risking their lives if necessary to finally bring down Trump and to finally bring about the end of this traumatic nightmare. Whatever happens on November 5th, 2024, whether it brings salvation or suffering, damnation or deliverance, decency or dystopia, in the long run, the odds remain overwhelming that Donald Trump will ultimately face justice and will ultimately die in prison as the truly dark, reviled, traumatic and cautionary figure of history that he long since deserves to be. Whatever happens, and however long it takes, I urge you to stay strong, stay brave, love and care for each other, and hold strong to that blessed eventual deliverance.